Good afternoon from London, and good evening to those joining us from Asia, and good morning in the US. My name is Erik Berglof. I'm the director of the LSE Institute of Global Affairs at the LSE School of Public Policy. I'm also a proud CEPR fellow for many more years than I care to remember. You are most welcome to this webinar on how do we end up here, governance lessons from COVID-19. This is part of a series that we are organizing on the early lessons from COVID-19, and what we are doing this together with CEPR and the LSE School of Public Policy. So the epicenter of COVID-19 has moved from China via Europe and then to the United States. And now the pandemic is developing very quickly in South America, Africa, and South Asia. And we have now a new serious outbreak in Beijing, possibly closing the circle. Countries have responded differently, but certain patterns have emerged. And in Europe, which will be the focus of today's discussion, most countries opted to suppress the epidemic curve through strict lockdown measures, and in some cases after very rapid surges in the number of cases. But some countries stand out for their different approach. Sweden is one and United Kingdom is the other. UK later changed its policies to become more in line with the rest of Europe. So the purpose of today's discussion is not to pass judgment on whether one strategy is better than another. As the authorities in both countries are quick to tell you, it's too early to do that. And we do have some early indications, but it is true that there are still many stages of this pandemic to play out. So what we want to focus on today is how decisions were made or not made, and what governance mechanisms were in place to correct possible mistakes. Of course, in assessing these decisions and governance mechanisms, it's important not to forget the extraordinary uncertainty that decision makers at all levels at the beginning of this pandemic we're facing. And in many respects, we still face these uncertainties. And we are 5 months into the pandemic. There was uncertainty about the virus, how dangerous it was, how fast it would spread, what impact it would have on those infected, how this varied across groups, age groups, gender, ethnic groups, and so on. Whether the virus would evolve as it traveled through the world. When, if ever, we would have a vaccine. What about antiviral treatments? When would we get effective treatments? And if we found a vaccine, would we be able to vaccinate all the people as quickly as we wanted? So all these uncertainties, but there were also uncertainties about the social science dimension of this. There were uncertainties about how strong were the defenses of our societies, what would be the political fallout from the epidemic. So we shouldn't forget this uncertainty when we look at what decisions were taken, how decisions were taken. And as I said, the uncertainty involved both science and social science. And we know the pandemic has generated sort of a pandemic of research, both in sciences and in the social sciences. I've certainly personally never experienced anything similar in my academic career. The level of activity has been extraordinary from the time when the first genetic sequencing of the virus was put up by the Chinese in early January. Journals have taken down paywalls and referee procedures have become simplified. Journal editors are flooded with submissions in both science and social science journals. So the first question to ask is how policymakers, in this case in Europe, made use of the information that came out of Wuhan and the very active research communities. What was the interaction between policymakers at different levels and between politicians and the bureaucracy during this crucial time? How were the key decisions taken and by whom? Who shaped the narrative supporting specific policy choices? Where was the accountability? What were the checks and balances? I mean, there are many questions here that we have, given the tremendous uncertainty, who should have the burden of proof? What is the role of the precautionary principle? The idea that, you know, when a human life is at stake, we should err on the side of caution. How did policymakers adjust as they learned more about the virus, and particularly how the pandemic played out in their own country? In the UK, there was a change of policy. How did that happen? What drove the change? What did we learn from that episode? Well, there are some of the issues that we hope to address in today's conversation. But ultimately, there are also bigger questions about the role of science in governance and the relationship between scientists and politicians. What is the role of scientists in situations when you face such radical uncertainty? What are the risks of politicizing science? Science and scientists are seldom fully neutral, and we are dealing with questions of life and death. It's hard to leave out values and emotions completely. We have also seen how scientists have become politicized or allowed themselves to become politicized. So initially, we thought that the pandemic would be the return of the credibility of science after some years of challenges from populism and anti-expert sentiments. But, and it was certainly true in the UK where I live now, but it's also true in the US. But increasingly, people have come to realize that science is not a monolith or is not free from challenge. The disagreements within the scientific community have been laid bare, and there are also instances where groupthink and lack of internal and external checks and balances have become apparent to people. So, and scientists suddenly looked rather naked in many people's eyes. And it's interesting to note that in a recent paper by Barry Eichengreen and Shevat Aksay and others, they find that the trust in science in countries where people in the formative period of their lives were hit by pandemics, the support or the belief and or trust in science have come down. But there was also an issue of trust in society, particularly in Sweden. An important argument in the Swedish case was the idea that people trusted government and the government trusted people trusted each other to do the right thing. These different dimensions of trust are challenged in a pandemic. And it may even be a possibility that this trust becomes a trap, as there is not enough challenge to the views put forward by scientists and by bureaucrats and policymakers, and who often put themselves sort of base their positions on science, or claim to base their decisions on science. And of course, there's a big question: what will happen to trust in government if the chosen strategies turn out to be mistaken? So I had managed to put together a dream team for this webinar, but this morning, Devi Sridhar, who's, as many people here in the UK, but also globally would know, is a very prominent professor of global health. She is ill. Even professors in global health can get sick. So she had to step out of the panel, and in a very hostile move by the government here in the UK, they have moved the meeting of the scientific advisory group in emergencies, SAGE, from 11 to 1 to 1 to 3, directly to clash with our webinar. So Jeremy Farrar, if he can join us, can also only join us at the very end. So that leaves me with Bengt, Holmstrom, and Karolina Ekholm, but this will give us more time to develop their perspectives, and also for us to have more interaction with the audience. So I'm very much looking forward to that. Most of you are getting used now to the Zoom technology, but you can use the Q&A function and the chat room if you want to ask questions. If you want to come in and ask in person with your image, you should just raise your hand and I will bring you into the webinar. We're also broadcasting over Facebook, and you can post questions using the comment function, and we will try to bring some of them to the panel. Please introduce yourself with your name and affiliation, but more about this after the presentation. So we're going to start with Bengt Holmstrom. Bengt Holmstrom is, of course, a very well-known professor of economics at MIT. He won the Nobel Prize a few years ago, and has been one of the main thinkers around governance issues. And very luckily for us, he also were sort of drafted to help the Finnish government in shaping the policies in response to the COVID-19 pandemic earlier this year. And so Bengt can bring that perspective, and I'm going to have a separate presentation of Karolina later. So I'll let you, Bengt, start now, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Erik. Like Erik already said, I think this is an exceptional crisis in at least two ways. One of which is that it is a dual crisis, which I don't think any of us have experienced before. First the health crisis and then the economic crisis, and we may see still more coming. We see also already signs of a social crisis and political crisis. The other, I think, exceptional feature of this is that the virus is particularly challenging. That is, this is as nasty virus as it can be, paradoxically, because it's actually, in a way, relatively mild. And the fact that it's relatively mild has had people, there's a group of people, including, I suppose, initially the UK, that sort of thought this is just a regular little flu. You know, Brazil is still pushing that line, and most others have left it away. But there's a question of why is it such a big deal when the actual numbers of say death rates or something like that don't rise even probably to the level of seasonal flus. And I think there's a simple answer to that, and that's fear. This crisis and this whole sequence of events has one very dominant feature, which is people are afraid. And it is still, fear is sort of the thing that is driving everything that happens. If we by some magic would get the medication, even something that would alleviate the severity of the illness and the fearfulness of the illness, this would be over quickly. And until we control the fear, it won't be over. So it is the crisis, it's still the epidemic or pandemic that is sort of driving the economic role, though there is a strong sort of tension also between them now. Initially, it was all about the pandemic, so to speak, but now it's clearly the tension also between, you know, how do we navigate between reasonable economic activity and not letting the pandemic get out of hands and destroy our or eat up our hospital and ICU capacity and so on. I think that it's still the case, as I said, that I think it is the pandemic that is sort of the big issue here. And until the pandemic until the illness gets under control, we are not out of the woods. Maybe I should add that, you know, it is sufficient, I think, if we could somehow manage it so that the death rates or the treatments would be reasonable. Let me emphasize what Erik already said. It's very early to make strong judgments or statements here, and I will still do some of it, but one should keep in mind that opinions will change as this goes on. And so these are preliminary thoughts, mainly coming from my experience with Finland and the Nordic countries, but also, of course, following closely what's happening in the world. One starting point, or one of the puzzles here, I was on a committee to basically think about economics, but we ended up studying a lot the pandemic, because it's hard to think about the economics without understanding something about the pandemic. And one of the things that struck us economists, we were all economists, was that the forecasts were very wrong. The initial forecasts were very pessimistic. You know, there was the Imperial College forecast, there were other forecasts in Finland. They had fairly grim figures coming out, and that was, you know, we are talking about an order of magnitude error, at least initially. And so the question is, you know, why is that the case? And I think has to do, of course, with the uncertainty of the pandemic and its behavior. I think one of the things we got to see, at least in Finland and Sweden, I think is a fairly strong example of what one might call a paradigm attachment. Or, you know, and I think as economists, we are very familiar with this. We like to look at things, say financial crisis, we looked at it from our traditional models initially and reluctantly gave up on them. And I think this same thing happened to the epidemiologists. There's nobody to defend them here, so I can speak about that. But there was a lot of groupthink. And when we looked at the models, for instance, that were used in England, UK and Finland, they were fairly mechanical as far as I can tell. And one of the key features that they didn't contain that was troublesome in terms of prediction was that they didn't account for the fear factor at all, or not well. That is, they played with the R0, which everybody knows by now what it is, the infection rate, but or effectiveness, but they didn't look at you know, how people might react to it. And I think one reason, and the government was also react. And so one reason it didn't become so bad was that whether there were restrictions, strong restrictions or not, people just didn't, you know, took defensive measures, and that is something that economists understand, I think, better than probably epidemiologists. So I think economic models actually have quite a bit of say in terms of interacting with or understanding this crisis. The other thing that I think, this I'm not an expert on, but the epidemic is, we didn't understand how it spread, the transmission spread, and also how heterogeneous it was, that is, or clustered it was. So this meant that this R0 figure isn't, in my view, as significant. It's an average of something and can be very misleading from that point of view. So let me then say a few words about the government. The thing that I think is a topic here before us today is the question, you know, how the government deals with a crisis like this. And as I said, the crisis is special because it's a dual crisis. And so it involves a lot of ministers. So in Finland, you know, there's a finance minister about economics, there's a health ministry about the illness, there's the Department of Justice, because there were legal challenges to how one can proceed. So there was a lot of, say, I would call it red tape, but reasonable constraints on privacy and issues like that. All of this had to be resolved pretty quickly. And so coordinating all these ministries was an important challenge for the Finnish government. And on the whole, I must say, I think they did a pretty good job, both about communicating what was going on and working it out. So the presentations, in some sense, was for those who have looked at the American scene and Trump speaking. I'm speaking from Boston, so I see it every day, you know, or how he behaves and how they present themselves. Very different, say, from Finland, in the sense that in Finland they first kind of agreed among the ministries or what they would say every day, more or less, or every second day or whatever, and then they presented a pretty unified front to the public. And I think this has been, if one asks why Finland actually has been pretty successful, I think this is one dimension of it, is that it hasn't been consistent in terms of what they're doing, because information has come in and they have adjusted it, but they have tried to present a unified view. There hasn't been arguments, you know, one speaks and then the next comes and says, so in the US case, the president comes and says, you know, something entirely different from the experts. And they have, in that, the other sort of interesting tension there is a potential tension between the ministries, but there's a potential, there's also a big issue about the tension between bureaucrats and politicians. It's always there. And politicians are listening to what the public says, the bureaucrats, so to speak. I don't use that term in a derogatory sense, but just as a definitional term. They have a much different view of what's happening, and they have, of course, a lot more information than the politicians. So in Sweden, this is where I see a big difference, for instance, with Sweden and Finland, is that in Sweden was just constrained legally, and Karolina will talk more about that. But the government, the cabinet stayed pretty much out of it. That's how it started also in Finland. That is, the cabinet was very deferred things very much to the experts and to the epidemiologists and the Ministry of Health. But it's interesting to see that when the public started to become restless and worried, and the fear factors sort of kept growing, then the government actually took over. Unlike Sweden, the government started to impose its wills, and it did not just listen to the experts and to the epidemiologists, and finally basically overruled the epidemiologists who wanted to follow Swedish, essentially I think wanted to follow Sweden's path, but they couldn't do it. So that's an interesting sort of empirical case where they could listen to. I think Sweden didn't listen much to the facts coming in, whereas Finland sort of reacted thanks to the public to how things changed. So that's the extreme. So there is a huge difference, say, with a very centralized, say, organization like take China, where there is sort of only government. Of course, there's a very powerful government. Finland is somewhere in between, and Sweden is in the extreme of having actually, really the bureaucrats in charge in these cases, and we'll hear more about that. So that I think is an issue we haven't been presented in, or at least I haven't been presented with before very much when I think about the complexities that we encountered in this case. Let me go back a little bit to the epidemiologists and the defensiveness. One of the big issues, and this sounds like a little detail, but it's illustrative of these tensions, is that in Finland there has been a big debate about masks, and Finland actually doesn't encourage use of masks. And not only does it not encourage, there was a time when it says it's positively dangerous to use masks because you can touch the mask and then you can touch your eyes and so on. I think some of these arguments were borderline pathetic in my view, and that's a fairly strong statement. But it remains true that they still don't think that masks are valuable, because they have gone through a meta-analysis of all five studies of randomized controlled trials showing that masks are actually not proven very effective. There's no evidence that it's effective. So this raises the issue, a very interesting issue, I think, in this context. Who has the burden of proof? Is it in a situation like this? And Finland has taken the traditional view that we don't use masks normally because we don't have epidemics. And then comes something new on the table. The use of masks has to be proven to be effective. That's the view they took. The fact is that every sensible person understands that it can hardly be damaging to use masks, and there's a lot of evidence actually that it's effective. But they wanted randomized controlled trials to prove this case, and they are still working on it, by the way. And actually, I think that's just the wrong way even to think about the burden. The burden of proof should have been on them to prove that masks are actually harmful, because every piece of sensible logic suggests that the masks are pretty good. Maybe not very effective, but at least not dangerous. So this question of burden of proof in situations where you get into an entirely new situation, entirely new circumstances brings up a question that I never thought about before, but got to think about it in the context of this pandemic, and so that's one of the issues that I was thinking about. Let me finally close by saying there's a very big question, of course, how much, what's the role, say, of the private sector? It's not just bureaucrats and cabinet, say, or politicians who are involved here. They are also involved. The private parties are also involved, and one can delegate a lot to them. And so people ask, there is also this, say, extremists maybe, or free market people who think, why should the government, let just the private sector handle it. And we understand, of course, that the government has to come in, partly because an enormous externalities involved here. On the financial side, we can debate it a little more, but in the case of the illness and how to deal with it, there are those things. There's one thing that on the financial side is worth understanding, is that government has an advantage. What is the essential advantage of government, just very generally speaking, relative to the private sector? The advantage can be put starkly as saying the government doesn't have to maximize profits. It sounds paradoxical, but it doesn't have to be efficient, because it has missions and it has a whole range of issues where actually the striving for efficiency is very damaging for the in dealing with the externalities. And so one example here is the fact that the government can actually, it's the only party that really can provide insurance ex post. So all the private sector dealings that maximize profits, once the event has happened, you can't get insurance anymore. But government is in the position of actually seeing what is the nature of the problem that needs to be insured. And this is a very general point. It is equally true for the financial crisis as it is for this crisis. But the ability to sort of see the nature of the beast, or the nature, the dimensions of the problem, and then reconstruct an insurance scheme, so to speak, is a huge advantage for the government relative to the private sector. The private sector simply cannot deal with it. So I stop there. We were given more time, so I hope this was okay to speak for 15 minutes or whatever.
Thank you very much, Bengt, and very thoughtful remarks there. Karolina Ekholm, Karolina has been combining an academic career and a career in civil service, and to some extent even in politics, or I guess you were never had a political appointment, but maybe not politically active. But so you have passed these different worlds that Bengt talked about. So Karolina has been a deputy governor of the central bank in Sweden, and also a deputy finance minister responsible for the sort of international desk at the Ministerial of Finance. So Karolina, what is your perspective on what we saw in the Swedish case, and how you see it in the sort of Nordic context?
Yeah, so thank you, Erik, and thank you, Bengt, for a very interesting introduction to the subject matter. Well, as I guess most of the people participating in this webinar are aware of, Sweden stands out in both the chosen strategy to deal with the corona crisis, or the corona pandemic, in terms of being relatively lenient and not having very restrictive measures, no lockdown in Sweden. But Sweden also stands out, and this is at least the case more recently, in having also a fairly high proportion of deaths by COVID-19. So obviously there's a big discussion both in Sweden and outside Sweden, why Sweden has chosen a quite different strategy from other countries, and why Sweden has also much a higher fraction of deaths than its neighbors. I mean, Sweden is not one. I mean, there are countries in continental Europe and the UK also that have a higher fraction of deaths, but it's a very stark difference between Sweden and the other Nordic countries such as Denmark and Finland and Norway and also Iceland. So why is this? Well, when it comes to the death fraction of COVID-19, I mean, it's not entirely clear that the difference between Sweden and the other Nordic countries is caused by this difference in policy, although it is of course reasonable to assume that it is at least partly a result of the difference in strategy. But then the question is why Sweden has chosen a somewhat different strategy, given that I guess most people think that the Nordic countries work in a fairly similar way. Now here, I'm not so sure that the reason is a difference in governance structure, although there are some differences between the different Nordic countries that I'm going to mention in a minute. I think it seems to me that the health authorities in the different Nordic countries early on, they made relatively similar assessments of the situation when the coronavirus started to spread. But there were some slight differences in assessments, and I think they may have mattered in terms of the strategies adopted. So the Swedish Health Authority seems to have been less optimistic about the possibility of suppressing the virus in the long run by going into lockdown. I think if you look at statements made by the different health authorities, that seems to be the case. It also seems to be the case that the Swedish Health Authority puts stronger weight on the ability to sustain the chosen strategy for a long period of time. That's something that they have communicated quite clearly and emphasized many times. But then there are some differences in the way decision-making takes place in the Nordic countries. And one difference compared to Denmark and Norway, not so much a difference compared to Finland, is that there's no ministerial rule in Sweden. And this is, of course, also a difference compared to the UK. So a minister cannot really decide. Sorry, did someone say something or no? So a minister cannot decide how rules are applied in specific cases. A minister cannot on his own or her own decide either which rules should apply. The latter can be decided by the government as a collective, and the minister of course has a responsibility to prepare all the files advancing policy within his or her area of responsibility. In Sweden, and I think this also goes for Finland, if I understand correctly, government authorities are independent when it comes to making decisions in specific cases. And therefore, they're also ultimately responsible and accountable for those decisions. So if I were to make an analogy with the private sector, so that the government is like the board of a corporation that decides on strategic issues and policies and the budget, while the head of a government agency is like the CEO making operative decisions. But of course, as with boards and management, there are close and frequent contacts between the government and its authorities. So it's not like the government authorities make things completely without consulting the politicians. So in this case, deciding on the overall strategy to deal with the corona pandemic is something that the government really has to take responsibility for and will be accountable for. But it will be accountable for it when it goes to the voters in the next election. So, I mean, this is not something that the government in Sweden can delegate to an authority. But the operative decisions that follow from the decision about strategy, that would be the responsibility of the authorities. And this makes, I think, or at least in my experience, for special challenges regarding cooperation between different authorities. And these are challenges that are exacerbated by the fact that we have regional and local governments with a high degree of autonomy, including the right to tax. And they also need to be part of such cooperation. And in this particular case, health services is actually the responsibility of the regional level, whereas elderly care, and of course, I guess everyone is well aware of that most of the deaths have occurred among age groups above 70 years old. And elderly care is the responsibility of the local level, the municipalities. So here, everyone really, in theory, need to cooperate. But there are different political leaderships at the different levels, central, regional, local, and there are different government agencies here that need to cooperate. And I think, when we evaluate this somewhere down the line, I think there will be many lessons learned about failures in cooperation across these different vertical levels and also horizontally. Now, given that Finland has a similar governance structure, of course, a relevant question to ask is why Finland then ended up making very different decisions going into lockdown, as Bengt described. Now, in the Finnish case, a difference is that a state of emergency was declared in mid-March, and that gave the government extraordinary powers. And if we go to Sweden, it's actually a difference in terms of the constitution, in the sense that a state of emergency is not really something that can be declared in a peacetime crisis. But of course, there are, according to the existing laws, they allow for restrictive measures, and the parliament can always speedily give the government powers that they agree to delegate to the government, and they have done so during this crisis. So, I mean, I'm not completely convinced that this constitutional difference is the main explanation for the difference in strategy. One could speculate that the different experiences historically when it comes to war may have played a role. So Sweden has not been involved in military conflict since the early 19th century, while Finland, Denmark, and Norway, they were all drawn into the Second World War, and Finland has also experienced a civil war, or did experience a civil war in the aftermath of the First World War. So maybe this, I mean, and this is very speculative, maybe this is something that makes the threshold higher in Sweden for making decisions that restrict the individual's rights in a crisis. I would still say that my own assessment is that the difference in strategy mainly would be caused by this difference that I mentioned in the beginning, a difference in assessment between the different health authorities in the different countries. And although it looks right now, this obviously looks like a pretty bad assessment on the part of the Swedish Health Authority, I think one also has to acknowledge that we don't really know what the difference in outcome is going to be after all of this is over. when we finally have some control over the virus. And I think that, you know, if we would have a vaccine or a very powerful antiviral treatment relatively soon, then the Swedish strategy is going to look like it's going to be assessed like as a failure, because the death rate will appear to be unnecessarily high. However, if it takes a really long time, and if we never really get an efficient vaccine, and it takes a long time to get effective treatment, it could very well be that Sweden won't look so much different from other countries in the end. So I'll stop here and open up for discussion.
Thank you very much, Karolina. Thank you for those very interesting remarks on also you have been inside this, so you have seen some of these issues play out in your own work experience. So we have quite a lot of questions. We have some time, and you know, one aspect that we haven't talked about, and none of you mentioned, and maybe because it wasn't important, but it's the EU dimension. So all the countries besides Norway are part of the European Union. And there's a question here from Charles Enoch, and he says, you know, the tension between politicians and bureaucrats, does this explain the slow response of the EU as a sort of bureaucrat-dominated institution? Conversely, it seems that those countries with decentralized management, such as Germany, where politicians are closer to the people, have done better. So, but I guess I have two questions in this. There's about the issue of a sort of the federation structures and, of course, the EU specifically. Was there a role for the EU in this? Did they play it, or did they fail to play a role? Bengt, from what you saw in Finland, did you?
Well, it's kind of interesting because, you know, if we go to Asia, it's clear that they have been very centralized around China, extreme, but even South Korea and others. They have had a heavy hand, and of course they have had the experience also. So, you know, normally in a situation like this, you would think that actually having a strong center deciding everything is actually a bit, initially at least, a good thing. So in that sense, it's not the decentralized system, as we can see, for instance, in the US. US is certainly doing very badly with its decentralized model right now. But I think it's more a sort of internal government. It's the relative power, I think, between the politicians and the bureaucrats that played a role in Finland. That's why I contrasted Finland and Sweden, because you know, I agree with Karolina in many things, but I do think that just look at the difference. In Finland, it was always the ministers, 5 ministers typically, speaking every day or every second day to the people on what they are planning to do. There were sometimes some experts with them, but the prime minister was every time there, and she was standing there and explained what the line was. It was very clear that in Finland, the government every day made the decisions about these things. In Sweden, every day it was the head of the agency who spoke, and I don't know, I didn't follow it, but I did see that he was all the time. He was on the various you know, posters and other things. He's almost like a cult figure in Sweden. I mean, it's a I would say a little strange, to put it mildly, that somebody like him would get the kind of admiration and love letters and all this. Sort of Sweden somehow rallied around this figure. And I think Sweden needs to think about it, because it is a kind of an odd feature of the Swedish case, in my view, and to some extent the indifference to the deaths at least surprised the Finns a lot. That there was very little discussion about the very high numbers of deaths. So I think those are the in my view, the difference. I want to underline that the Finland first listened very carefully to the minister and the head of the agency, the health agency that was in charge of this epidemic or pandemic. But then they diverted, then they overruled them. That's what I'm underlining, Karolina. You know, I mean, the Prime Minister in Sweden has just stood by this agency, I think because, well, you may know the reasons, but I think he is in a weaker position than the Finnish ministers. And they listened to the people's restlessness, and they made judgment that this agency may not know exactly what it's doing. Whether that's the right judgment or not, but I think it's clear that the agency, we are all in a very uncertain waters, and sometimes the wisdom of the crowd, so to speak, is of some value, and the Finnish government acted on that, and you're right that they had the power to act relatively quickly. So I think the difference in the governance structure is whether it's just in the way it was carried out or actually in the legal structures, but the differences are really there.
Karolina, you have been very deeply involved in the connection between the EU level and the national level, and you were not part of this particular incident. But how do you see, first of all, what did the EU play a role here, and secondly, this question, EU's way of responding, particularly initially, seemed indeed to have been rather it was removed from the political process in many ways. It was when the politicians came in later on that things changed a bit. But Karolina, what's your take?
I mean, I think it mattered that there was a new commission coming in. Yeah. I mean, they were relatively new when all of this happened. So they seemed to have not I mean, they were obviously not, they didn't have their eyes on the ball in the beginning, so to speak. I mean, it's well, I guess it has been written a lot about how von der Leyen initially didn't even talk about the corona virus early on. When she made speeches, she talked about other things. And I think that played a role, that they were just starting out as a commission. But then, of course, the whole setup, I mean, there's always a question about how much sort of political legitimacy the Commission has, or I mean, the EU structure is, I mean, you have the Commission that you could think of as some sort of government, you have the Parliament, and then you have the Council, which is a little bit, I mean, you can't really translate that to a national level, but when I was part of this, I, of course, was a part of the whole Council structure. And in my view, that's where all the difficult political decisions are being taken. And I think that's because the democratic underpinning of the structure really goes mainly through the Council, in my view. Of course, the Parliament is the part that has these directly elected people, but it's a kind of a strange parliament in the sense that they have no responsibility for financing whatever ideas they come up with. So it's not like a national parliament in that way. And also the interest for voting in elections to European Parliament is quite limited. So you can question the democratic legitimacy of the Parliament. And the Commission is, of course, I guess that from the question, I guess that's the part that is really maybe driven quite a lot by bureaucrats. I mean, it's quite a bureaucrat-heavy type of organization, and then you have these commissioners on top of this with political staffs. But I think when they are really limited in their actions by what's being underwritten in the capitals. That's my experience, at least. If we're dealing with difficult political decisions, it's all about negotiating with the capitals and the different coalitions of countries that are pushing different types of interests in these instances. Of course, the most noticeable actions that the Commission has taken lately is on the economic side, in terms of proposing a recovery facility or instrument. They also, of course, have now combined that with a new proposal for a long-term budget, but that's something that there were ongoing negotiations about already before. I mean, I have some critical views about that proposal, but that could maybe we could leave that for a completely different type of discussion. But in terms of other aspects, I mean, they've tried to put a stop to the countries preventing hospital equipment being exported. I guess they eventually succeeded. They've tried to create a unified strategy for opening up and opening borders with kind of limited success. So yeah, I think the Commission is sort of struggling in dealing with a situation like this, where I think that the national level is just takes over because it's a crisis and it's just too important somehow. I wanted to say something about, yes, about what Bengt said. I agree with him that it is a little bizarre with this cult that has emerged around the state epidemiologist, Anders Tegnell. I mean, not because there's anything wrong with him. I mean, he's a reasonable person, but the way that some people have gone sort of overboard in supporting him, and you know, there have been media reports about people getting tattoos of his face. I mean, that strikes me as very, very odd. And I mean, it's kind of interesting to think about why, you know, why is that? And this is speculation again, but I think maybe one reason is that people are so unused to hearing experts communicating. I mean, he talks a little bit like a dry academic, but that's so unusual because we're so used to hearing politicians speaking from speaking points, and in Sweden those speaking points are being always negotiated in the whole of government offices. And I think that has endeared him to some people, that he's not a smooth talker like a political leader typically is. But by and large, I agree with Bengt that it's a strange phenomenon.
So thank you. And you know, one thing you would think would emerge from an experience like this, we saw it, for example, in the forest fires in Sweden, when you know, we realized that we didn't have the capacity to fight these fires on our own, and we needed to get support from the EU, and we got, you know, parades of Polish firefighters through the country, and we got helicopters from the outside and so on. And after that, there was a kind of realization in Sweden, and you could see it in the opinion polls, that actually for some types of emergencies, there may actually be a reasoning for having capacity at the EU level. Do you see something like this emerging, or is this I think very correctly said, that when it's about human lives, the national level becomes extremely important. But of course, forest fires are also potentially deadly and so on. What determines whether countries are willing to give up decisions over this kind of health issues?
Yeah, it's a good question, and
the background is, of course, that if you look at the treaties of the European Union, health has very few powers for
it's
the
not
European.
Delegated.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think at least in Sweden, I think that goes for all the Nordic countries. There's a strong there's an unwillingness to give more powers to the supranational level. I think these powers are guarded quite strongly. So it goes for health issues. And there are other issues that comes up now with proposal for this recovery fund about taxation, for instance. That's also another area where there's no EU competence, but national competence. So I think, at least in Sweden, there's some skepticism against this supranational level. But then, as you point out, when crises occur and it turns out that there are in fact advantages with helping or sort of pooling resources, which was the case in terms of these forest fires, then it may look different. And I would say that in Sweden, of course, the opinion is generally very EU positive. So, it's not like in the UK. Most Swedes are quite positive towards EU cooperation and the single market and these things. But I would say sort of guard things like, as you mentioned, things that relate to life and death and taxation, which is kind of similar importance for Swedes. Then they guard that quite carefully.
I have a question here from Jesper Roine.
I have several questions, but I'll stick to one to start with. I'm curious about your views on.
Jesper, sorry, can you say who you are?
Sorry. I'm Jesper Roine. I'm a researcher, economist, professor at the Stockholm School of Economics and site in Stockholm. Thanks a lot for your interesting remarks. One thing that I was wondering is how you view the lessons that we can draw from this, first phase of this crisis with respect to sort of the preparedness, the necessity of planning and being prepared versus the sort of necessity to take in new information when we're facing a new situation. Bengt touched upon this in a very particular sense with the masks and what requirements we should have on scientific knowledge about the use of masks. But in a broader sense, initially there was a lot of talk in Sweden especially that we weren't prepared sufficiently. We have lost our preparedness, and some speculated about connections to lack of war experience, etc. But then, when you look into it, it turns out that we were in some senses quite well prepared. But then others have pointed to that this is a totally new situation and totally new epidemic. So we're learning things all the time, and we need to be agile and quick to react to new information. So there's a bit of tension there, I think, between sort of being prepared and having a good plan on the one hand, and then on the other hand, being quick to respond. Bengt, I guess, is part of the commission that was quickly sort of put together to monitor the situation economically, etc. But which shows that Finland had a sense of, we need to take a lot of knowledge from different fields here to be prepared to address the new situation. What are your takes on this tension, or is there no tension?
Yeah, I think Jesper is right. I mean, I think Finland took a very pragmatic view, and I would say the bureaucrats took a dogmatic view, but the government, because it was influenced perhaps partly by the public, I think did well in terms of adjusting to reality. You know, one could look at Sweden, and Karolina can speak. You can hear that I'm relatively critical to Sweden because they have basically stuck their course, and sort of repeatedly said there's nothing else we need to do. Of course, some at the margin, you know, the elderly care and such needs to be adjusted, but they, just like Karolina originally explained, they have a sort of long-term plan and they want to stick to that plan. So it's understandable also that they haven't changed it perhaps. It's a big bet, because if we get the vaccine, they will look bad, or if we can handle the fear factor in some other way, then the fact is that a lot of lives have been lost, sort of relative to the others. But I think the answer is that that explains why they are not changing perhaps their view, whereas Finland never, well, they abandoned the sort of very dogmatic view, and I would also put it, give credit for the fact that they were very well coordinated. In Finland is a smaller country. It has a tradition of actually having everybody knows everybody, and it has its bad downsides. But in a situation like this, we tend to come together and be able to work together rather effectively. So, and that includes you know, adjustments to new information, and I think they that's a necessity. I don't think one could be prepared for this crisis. You know, there were a lot of masks, for instance. Finland had millions of masks, but it turned out that when they went to pick them up, they all fell apart. They were so old. So, you know, the truth is that they were not prepared in that sense. And let me just comment on one thing about the fire versus the. Isn't the reason why they could coordinate the fires in EU was that, you know, this wasn't every country being hit by fires and they are fighting fires. But I mean, it's easy to go to help one country and easy for the country to take help. Here we are, everybody's hit by the same thing, and they have different views about how to handle it. So I think terrible cases. It's just that simple.
Karolina, do you have any?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that you probably, in this case, was almost impossible to be prepared, because it has been such a novel type of crisis. And of course, in Sweden, there's been a lot of debate about the lack of stockpiles of this kind of medical equipment, or like face masks and things like that. But as Bengt explained, maybe if we had those stockpiles, maybe they wouldn't have helped, because they would have fallen apart. But in Sweden, many of those stockpiles were just destroyed at various points because they took space, and you know, there was a sense that you didn't really need them. I mean, one issue that I think comes up when you discuss these things is efficiency versus resilience. So I think very often, also when it comes to the public sector, you try to improve efficiency, but of course, you also need to be aware that you need to ensure resilience, so that you have the ability to deal with sort of negative shocks in various ways, and then you can't have slimmed down things too much. And I think that could be one issue in Sweden, that in parts of the health sector that has been very slimmed down organizations resource-wise. But then I also think that there is something about this that Bengt was mentioning regarding groupthink. I mean, my experience at the central bank, I think that was a lesson in groupthink. I mean, when it comes to monetary policy, you set up these committees in order to avoid groupthink, but there's still kind of a high risk that you just have a group of people that become completely set on a particular strategy, and in the face of evidence against that strategy, you just kind of dig your heels in and double down. So I think that this is, in terms of how organizations work, I think this is something you really need to be aware of and work with proactively to try to avoid groupthink. It's a very bad thing.
Can I just say one word, Erik? We have to realize and your example brings it up in a different way, but as economists, as I said before, we are not better than the epidemiologists. I mean, you saw the same phenomena. We look at things from our familiar models, and it took us a long time to realize even the financial crisis had dimensions that people were not used to think about. And it was sort of outsiders that brought to our attention that one needs something else. It was evident to everybody in some sense that something big was going on, whereas finance people, I guess me included, would say, well, this is just the way it's going to go. And you hear the same thing in this epidemiology, where basically they are telling, it's going to, everybody is basically going to get infected until it's, herd immunity, and it's going to come back over and over. We can't do anything. That was the attitude, at least in Finland. I think it was pretty much, Finland was very closely aligned with Sweden, the epidemiologists, that is. And so it's sort of beyond groupthink in the small sense of a little committee. It's actually a whole field shows groupthink, and I think it's a lesson. But on the other hand, we have to have some common views, otherwise we can't communicate. So there's a trade-off.
We haven't spoken much about the sort of economic trade-off here. What do you say that the, this is a question from Piroska Noj-Mahaji, that she first says, thank you to two brilliant panelists, but she's a question for Karolina. While it's too early to say, what has been the relative economic performance of Sweden so far versus the neighboring Nordic countries?
I mean, most forecasts would have Sweden being hit roughly in roughly the same way. And I mean, Sweden is a small open economy, heavily reliant on its interaction with the rest of the world. So that means that when the rest of the world is doing poorly, Sweden is doing poorly. I would say that the whole Nordic region in most projections seem to be doing fairly well. So the OECD had a forecast that came this week, where the Nordic region, I mean, the projection was a loss of GDP this year somewhere between 5% and 10%, whereas in a lot of countries in more southern Europe, it was more a fall in GDP of 10 to 15%. So I think the region as a whole seems to be doing better, but Sweden doesn't seem to be doing very much better than its Nordic neighbors.
Since we were talking about cooperation, has there been sort of a level of cooperation at the European, at the Nordic level?
I think there have been constant contacts both at the political level and between the health authorities. I mean, that's quite clearly the case. I mean, they are colleagues and they seem to be talking to one another. And of course, there's been a lot of media attention in Sweden regarding the fact that the other Nordic countries, they haven't opened their borders to Sweden, which I think is it's kind of presented as you know, a small, like a conflict, if you wish. But of course, I think probably a lot of people in Sweden, they, given the difference in how much the virus has spread in these countries, I don't expect a lot of Swedes would want to put themselves in this situation of risking spreading the virus further to their neighbors. But this seems to be maybe something as kind of a contentious issue among the Nordic countries, or between Sweden and the others.
Do you think the pandemic could bring the possibility and desire in developing countries to form new unions and cooperating councils? So we spoke about the EU, we spoke about the Nordic. We see now that, of course, a lot of governments now, or countries that are being hit in the developing world, are have very limited resources, and if there are possibilities to pool resources, do you think that this can, the African Union, for example, has just taken on appointed special envoys on to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic? Do you think, will this give new life to some of these corporations within the developing world or not?
I mean, the problem is, of course, what I guess Bengt was mentioning before, that a lot of countries are being affected simultaneously. And that's something that, I mean, so in the European Union, we saw early that countries put restrictions on sending or exporting hospital equipment. And sort of more recently, there have been collaborations and offering hospital beds to countries such as Italy, that has been especially hard hit by the coronavirus. So there are these examples, but I think this would be easier if it was something that only affected some countries. But when a lot of countries in the same region are being hit simultaneously, then of course there is this risk that everyone is sort of more looking to themselves. But I would certainly encourage trying to cooperate as much as possible between countries to help one another, because it really could matter when it comes to something like this.
There's as you know, in Zoom, you can vote on the question. That is, you can make question go to the top by supporting this particular question. So here's a question from Adrian Wood. Why did the two countries, Sweden and the UK, whose governments talked most about the coronavirus policies being guided by science, have among the highest excess mortality rates? So you have touched on this earlier, but do you think there is what is the connect? Is this just a coincidence, this correlation, or maybe it's not even true? I can think of other countries that have also used science to justify what they were doing, and certainly also been some countries where actually scientists have been in power, vice president in Taiwan, for example, and several members of, well, you have of course also Angela Merkel in Germany has use some of our authority from science. But is there a link here or not?
Well, I mean, well, as Bengt pointed out, I mean, the scientists' advice was followed in Sweden and initially in the UK, of course. Then the UK switched strategy, but that was on the back of, at least as people interpret the situation. I mean, this report from also epidemiologist in Oxford was a relevant factor in the turnaround regarding the UK policies. Whereas in Finland, as Bengt described, the politicians overruled the scientists, and I think he's right in his assessment that this was done because the politicians' assessments was that the voters would punish political decisions makers that didn't completely prioritize saving lives. I mean, I think the epidemiologists were more thinking of, you know, what's the main scenario, and in the long run, I mean, yeah, a lot of people are going to die anyway, but that's not something that you as a political leader can go out and defend to your voters, that, yeah, we think that in the end a significant fraction of the population is going to die, so we're not really going to do very strong things here. It doesn't work politically. Whereas, and I mean, then you can ask, you know, why didn't then the Swedish politicians also overrule the scientists in Sweden? And I think that's yeah, it is a question, and I mean, I can't answer that because I don't know exactly how they reasoned, but I think they mainly sort of have supported the strategy drawn up by the scientists, and they have believed that that's the best strategy also in terms of saving lives in the long run.
We have a question from China here.
Comment on.
Okay, Bengt, okay, go ahead.
I'm still here. I just want to comment that I think this is a moment to say that I think relying on just one scientific group is not a good idea. And so I think one of the lessons in my view is that you need to be fairly broad about asking advice of various groups. And I think, for instance, Germany had a cross-scientific committee. Norway has had a broad cross-scientific committee. Finland had several committees, you know, the economics committee that I was involved with, and then others, and then also a cross-scientific committee. So, you know, I think in a new situation like this, relying just on one you know, one agency or one person almost, you know, one view, I think that is almost under all circumstances risky and ill-advised.
Yeah. So we have a question here from China. So Jin Tao, you have the floor.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, panelists. So I'm Jin Tao, a current student from LSE. So my question is about evidence. As the panelist list has already mentioned, that we need evidence from all sides. But sometimes, as we see in this pandemic, we do not have sufficient evidence from both sides. For example, in terms of herd immunity, like we do not have evidence to support that those people who recovered from COVID-19 will have long-term immunity. So far there's no evidence for that. And at the same time, we do not have evidence to show that we can eliminate the pandemic in short term. So now it seems like we have in kind of this situation that we do not know whether we should go for strict lockdown or we should go for herd immunity. There's no sufficient evidence from both sides. So in this situation, which is actually very common, how should government make policies and decisions, and whether these decisions are really justified? Thank you.
Well, Bengt, this was your some of your initial remarks were about this. Can you maybe?
I didn't understand the word. Was it humility or humidity, or I wasn't clear on the one of the words?
No, I think herd immunity.
Okay, herd immunity. Sorry.
Yeah.
I think it is. You have to make decisions, obviously, and I should declare myself as an utter Bayesian. That is, I don't believe that I think you get evidence for everything, including theories that are totally wrong, like Modigliani-Miller theorem or something like that. They are extremely useful in informing how we think about this. So this sort of evidence-based wave that's sweeping the world, the economic world right now, I think needs to be adjusted eventually. So I think the best the government can do is absorb evidence and try to come to some consensus. I don't have any wisdom about how there isn't a strict rule about it, but I think avoiding groupthink is perhaps the one thing that I would avoid. But eventually, there's got to be somebody also in charge and call the shots. And I don't, we'll have to be open to alternatives. And so that's one argument to be containing the, not shooting for herd immunity immediately, because that's an extremely risky strategy.
Karolina, anything to comment on this? Or?
I mean, let me just say that, I mean, quite often the Swedish strategy is presented as a strategy to obtain herd immunity, but I don't think that that's entirely correct. As I mentioned initially, I think the strategy was more finding a way to mitigate the spreading of the virus in a way that would be sustainable over a long time, and mitigating it to the point that the healthcare system wouldn't be overwhelmed. There was also part of this trying to protect vulnerable groups that obviously failed, but at least that was sort of part of the strategy. So I don't think that this herd immunity, it was never part of, it was not at least sort of the main objective of this strategy.
But even so, I think there have been forecasts about the level of immunity in the population, and that those have been quite mistaken. I mean, it goes back to what we said about the uncertainty of the virus, and we.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know. I mean, so what we do get evidence on is sort of the proportion of people with antibodies. But we don't really know. I mean, we don't know exactly what that means and what is required for you to develop antibodies and how much immunity that gives you. I mean, there are so many unknowns in this.
No, absolutely. So can I give the last question here to Giancarlo Spagnolo? Are you?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. I'm also a researcher at SITE in Stockholm, and I have a very fast question for Bengt. Can we see, I mean, both Sweden and Finland seems to have said they want to apply only science-proved methods, which are backward-looking. And here we have a new situation which obviously should have a forward-looking, science-based risk management policy. This seems to be obvious to anybody. So to me, it seems to be a complete misunderstanding from these institutions, which I I'm not sure they're so scientists. I see them more bureaucrats. They mistakenly think that only following the backward-looking science is being scientific. If we would do this to climate change, we would only act against climate change when we had the scientific proof that they were going out of our chances. And to Katarina, I just wanted to ask you why Sweden tested so little, so late, given that they had a loose policy. We all know that testing is crucial and they had all the time to prepare. Why testing so little and so late compared to other countries? Thank you.
Bengt, do you want to start?
Yeah, I sort of answered already my part of the question, which is I think there is a danger in sort of saying we need sort of enough evidence before we'll do anything. Doing nothing is a decision. So you are all the time having to make decisions. So I agree with Giancarlo, and nice to see you again. I happen to be a commentator on Giancarlo's thesis 30 years ago or something like that. So it's nice to see you in this context.
Karolina.
Yes, well, I and Giancarlo used to be colleagues, so it's I should also say it's nice to see you. And it's a good thing that you bring up this the lack of testing in Sweden, because that's also an area where Sweden stands out. And I mean, I don't have I don't really know exactly what went wrong. I can mainly speculate. I think early on it was a lack of equipment to carry out testing in a large scale. And as the virus became fairly widespread, I also think that the health authority didn't put a lot of emphasis on the need for testing at that point. They put, and that could have also been influenced by the lack of resources to do it. But they didn't really push this very hard. They instead just communicated that if you have any sort of symptom, you should just stay home and not go out. And then I think at the political level, I think there was a sense that this raised questions among the citizens. So the politicians at some point wanted to have a more broad-based testing than what was going on. And then I think we ended up in this kind of governance mess, because in order to actually do that, a lot of different layers of governance and different authorities would have needed to cooperate. And my impression is that they didn't really do that. And I think this is a weakness in the way Sweden operates in these kind of situations. And I think whenever there was going to be a commission evaluating various measures undertaken in connection with this crisis, I think this will become a focus area, and trying to sort out why on earth there was a failure to roll out extensive testing in a reasonable amount of time. I think right now it's just, you can just observe that this is a failure.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you very much to everybody who's asked questions. I have not been able to bring you all in or to ask all the questions that you have posed. We will send the questions to the panelists and see if maybe we can stimulate some further exchange. I'm not going to attempt to summarize. I think we have seen, the complexity of these decisions that are under radical uncertainty and the dangers of groupthink, the importance of recognizing that science often have many different viewpoints, and scientists are also influenced by all kinds of other considerations, and I think an important distinction, apparently between the Swedish experience and it seems the Finnish experience, and I would argue also to some extent the UK experience, has been that there's been from the government side or the politicians' side rather have more clearly taken the ultimate responsibility. I think in the UK we have gone back and forth a bit between politicians actually taking responsibility and then delegating, and right now we are in some intermediate land. This committee that Jeremy Farrar is tied up in, the scientific advisory group in emergencies, they have been kind of distanced to some extent by politicians more recently. I don't know what comes out of today's meeting, but it's an important issue to think about. And as Karolina said, there will be a commission appointed in Sweden to look into all these reasons. So there will be many opportunities to come back and revisit these questions. I think they're important, of course, not only in Sweden, but they're important much more generally. And we need to learn from this. And preparedness here probably is not so much about how many masks you have stored and quality of these masks and so on. It's really about having the right governance procedures in place and making sure that you have the right accountability. And we've understood that accountability was a big issue in the Swedish case between different levels of governments and so on. So thanks again. It was a smaller panel than intended, but I think we have had a chance to go a little bit deeper into the Swedish case than would have otherwise. So thank you very much, and be safe, everybody.